What do you want to tell us before we just let it roll?
Well, it's kind of in conversation with Prima Facie. I'll give you that as a bit of a trigger warning. Having said that, basically, after I wrote Prima Facie, and I was telling Ange this before, is that I have a son and a daughter, and I thought, I wrote that play and it felt really strong, but I thought, what is it that women have to wear, the cost of this, and why are we looking at women about sexual assault rather than wondering how it comes about that someone becomes a perpetrator of a sexual assault, and what is that conversation? So really, all my plays are about starting a conversation, not giving you the answers because I don't know them. And I think what's been really interesting about this in the UK is the conversation afterwards, and interestingly with men as well as women. So I just really hope you enjoy it and that maybe it triggers some kind of conversation between all of us.
Absolutely incredible, Suzie. What is it like for you to see it here at home with an audience here on the big screen?
To be in Australia and see it, and it's the first time I've seen it on screen actually, so that was kind of whoa.
You mentioned it was a companion piece of sorts to Prima Facie, and you're single-handedly getting us to use a lot of Latin. So, what does Inter Alia mean?
Inter Alia means amongst other things, and really you probably noticed in the story that one of the things I wanted to explore was how working mothers basically fit their lives in amongst other things. They basically work and parent and run a home and do all of that which overlaps each other constantly, and we all have stories of that. But one of the really interesting things for me was the response afterwards to the play was that so many women said, I've never seen my life like that on stage before. And it occurred to me that I guess there haven't been that many working women playwrights who have actually been staged that can actually have that experience and talk about it. But I think it's a really common experience for women of my generation and after, that they're working and they're juggling and they're trying to make everything work. And they're feeling guilty about their parenting and guilty about their job, and they merge at the edges. And the designer did a wonderful way of making it even look like it's merging at the apron of the judge outfit and things like that. So there were little kind of ways of showing, not telling.
You mentioned that conversations that took place after people had seen Prima Facie got you thinking of where you would go with the story here. What was the line there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things with Prima was, and there's been a big outreach program with it, which is just to remind all of us that sexual assault is, the shame is not on women. Women are the unfortunate victims and survivors of sexual assault so often. But there's nothing they can do to stop it. And I thought, well, the shame is actually on perpetrators. But I thought, if we're not talking to boys, or we're not exploring what we've done to create a community where boys don't understand the rules, then why is that? And how do we actually attend to that? And I don't have the answers for it. I just wanted to start the conversation that it's not even that boys are to blame, it's that boys have just, we've given them a huge amount of information online. We've given them access to everything you can imagine, 24/7 porn, etc. And we haven't actually had communications that match that about how that, and we don't understand the kind of, as mothers, or at least I don't, understand that kind of bro zone and manosphere that's so luring them into a place where there's this casual misogyny, and when is that ever, I guess, interrogated at its source? And I think one of the things was, I had a friend of mine in, when Prima was on Broadway, a male friend of mine from Canada came up to me and said, I'm a bit anxious if I look back at the sex I had in my 20s. A really sensitive, lovely man saying, I can't talk to my sons because I'm a bit anxious about, how much did I check in or not check in? He said, I really did. We just sort of went with it, really. So I thought, if we're not having conversations, we're expecting boys in this era to kind of raise themselves, really.
That was a very powerful speech from Michael, explaining, when she's saying, I did everything I thought I could do, what did you do? And he says, well, hang on, I looked back and I didn't know whether I always did the right thing.
Yeah, but I mean, it's an invitation also to the godfathers, the big cousins, the older brothers, the sport teachers, to have those conversations with younger men and give them some lines that help them to negotiate that bro zone, that boy locker field, where someone's making a comment that's really casual misogyny or even worse, And how you actually opt out of that. I think it's a really hard thing for young men to know how to opt out of rather than laughing along with. And that's the beginning of the slide towards massive disrespect against women. And I know that, as a woman and as a feminist, you raise your son with those ideals, but at a certain point, what they're hearing amongst their peers is different to what you're telling them. And there's that kind of weird thing where they think, I can't tell my mum what the jokes are at school anymore. And of course, that's part of becoming an adult and having a different taste. But as a male-female thing, you think, well, who's actually having the conversations with him that he needs the answers to if he can't tell me? Hopefully his dad, or hopefully a cousin, or hopefully an older brother. He hasn't got an older brother. But I just thought it's not just dads, because sometimes dads can't do it with their sons, but you just hope that all men who have young men in their lives, or young boys in their lives, somehow reach out and have a kind of uncomfortable conversation or a walk, or even ask them what's happening in those locker rooms and say, I know that this could happen, and how do you respond? And give them some wishy ways around it even. I mean, it's hard, but I think we have to stop it at its source. And in order to do that, it is something that we really need men to just come on board for. I mean, women can't do it all. So it's a really big invitation to say, and I think what has happened in London while this play has been on is that has been a conversation that has begun, or not just begun, but has actually been ramped up. That like men come out and go, I'm going home to talk to my son, or I'm going home to talk to my nephew, or whatever. So that kind of makes me happy. I think, there's a chance, and it's not that all boys want to talk to their parents or their old, but I think, getting them at early adolescence and sort of interacting and also letting them know that men can be vulnerable and make mistakes and still recover in a way.
The filmed version of Prima Facie, also by NT Live, is being shown to judges around the UK and Northern Ireland, those who are going in to judge rape cases.
Yeah.
And tell me this story about the judge who was in charge of writing the compendium of directions, which is the sort of the rule book for directions that must be given to a jury in a rape case, and the response she had to seeing Prima Facie on the screen.
Yeah, she called me 3 days after. She called me after it had been open for 3 days. And I told this story, so I'm sure some people have heard it, but it still is a shock to me because the show had just opened. We'd got good results. So I was finally having a sleep in and the phone rings and it's a very serious sounding English judge. I thought, and she wanted to speak to Suzie Miller, and I thought, oh no, this is going to be bad. Am I going to be sued, or are they going to pull the play? And she said, I saw your play last night and I wanted to speak to you urgently, and that made me feel a bit worse. And I was like, yes, okay, what's going to happen now? Life is full of surprises. And she said, the biggest surprise of all, I'm the judge who writes the compendium of what the directions to juries are, and I've been up all night redrafting the one on sexual assault, and I'd like to use some lines from the play. So, and she said, I just needed your permission.
You are a lawyer by trade.
I know, but look, that 2-minute conversation, I thought all those years of law school practice and all that went up to that 2-minute conversation.
But what I'm interested in is you saw a lot of things up close when you were practicing law that I think pushed you in the direction of moving out of practicing law and into becoming a playwright, into becoming a creative. Do you feel that you've been able to make more change through the arts, through doing this, than you did?
I think I really have, and I think maybe it's just specific to me. I'm not saying ever a lawyer should run out to be a playwright by any stretch, but I do know that, my very first play I wrote about the job that I had, which was called Cross Sections. It was at the Opera House, actually. That was an amazing time, like way back in 2003 or something. And I remember there were like 500 people a night, and afterwards, or probably not that many, I'm probably exaggerating, but they would come out afterwards and talk about the play, and I thought, gee, that's that many people a night talking about the questions that the play raises about homelessness and young people in trouble. And I thought, gee, every day I'd go to court and have the same kind of conversation with one judge. No one else would hear it. And I thought, maybe I can affect more people by just telling stories. And I had noticed that when I did sentencing matters in court, and I worked with homeless kids, so I would tell the story of my client and of the reasons why the state owed them an opportunity. More often than not would get something that was really helpful for that person. But I realised that it was in the strength of the narrative, not in my legal strength. As in, it was more that I could tell the story in a way that was sort of, heart-wrenching or a bit, that could create some empathy. And, I thought, wow, maybe I should be using that in a different way. And, and then I did take a lot of sexual assault statements while I was in that position, and I probably would take literally maybe 10 a week after 4 o'clock every night, and they were all really similar, harrowing stories of rape and sexual assault of young women under 25. And I heard the same story over and over again, and in the many, many years I did that job, I think 3 of them had convictions in court.
3?
Yeah. And I just remember thinking, there's something really, really wrong with the system if it doesn't pan out. When I know these, the only reason they came and gave me a statement was because I wasn't the police, obviously, but I was doing a victims' compensation application to get money for sexual assault therapy. So you only need sexual assault therapy if you're a sexual assault victim. As such, there was no reason for them to lie to me and cry for an hour in my office. And so, they're telling you the truth, because why else would they go to the bother of getting sex assault therapy? And so it was, I was in that unique position of going, I can tell everyone's telling the truth because there's nothing in it for them whatsoever.
Inter Alia is at the beginning of its journey. Prima Facie is a little further down the track. I believe the production is in 50 countries.
48.
48. Yeah. The NT live version is a huge hit in China.
Yeah, China's become, I know, it's really interesting to me that China has taken it so strongly and are talking about it like so much. It's really exciting. In fact, I'm going there soon to talk about it.
You're going to go there?
Yeah, in November. I know, it's just like I've never been to China, but it's like, actually it's really interesting. I met the Chinese football team in London, and they said it's a really big deal in China. And I thought, wow, I'm so excited by that.
You might be aware there's going to be a film version of Prima Facie starring Cynthia Erivo.
Yeah.
And that's on the
They're
way
filming
now?
it, they start first day of filming on Tuesday next week. So we just did the rehearsal period with Cynthia, who's astonishing. And it's a really different conversation because we also, in Prima it has gender and it also has class, but then we added race to the conversation to push the conversation further into kind of contemporary conversations. And, I've just been in the rehearsal room with the new family that we created, and it's really interesting just hearing these amazing women and men talk about exactly their experience in the court system.
You worked with the same team on Inter Alia.
We did exactly the same team. Justin Martin, who's Australian, and I didn't even know that when I started working with him. We must have magnets or something. But he's an astonishing director of talent, and really had to go to London to kind of make his mark. He's been there for 17 years. So he doesn't have an accent, which is why I didn't pick it.
And why Rosamund?
Rosamund was, we wanted someone quintessentially British for the role of a British judge. And she was presented to us as someone that was very interested in doing it. And she's really, really smart. And she actually sort of was very keen to get on stage after 15 years off stage. And she, she was just extraordinary actually in the development period. I think it was much harder for her in rehearsal. There was a lot of anxiety about getting up on stage and doing that much and that many lines and so on. But she had 2 other people around her. She had the actors playing Michael and Harry, whereas I guess Jodie and Prima didn't have anyone.
She was on the Pat Malone.
Yeah, totally, yeah. Well, there was a funny story. I remember Sheridan Harwood, who was the original Tessa. She flew over there and she sat through the show, but just before it opened, she texted me and said, "This bitch has props." She didn't even have props. She did it like that. And I remember thinking, it's so Sheridan Harwood and her gorgeous humour. But yeah. But what I love about NT Live and the Opera House for bringing it here as well is the democratisation of theatre. It's something that's was just shown in 600 cinemas around the UK live from the National Theatre, that 2 nights later it's at the Opera House in Sydney for people to see. It means, when I was a kid, I actually never went to the theatre. I never saw theatre before I was 19 or something. But if it had been on at the local cinema, I think I might have seen it. And I might have started forming a kind of theatrical language within my own kind of vocab to talk about making theatre, maybe earlier than I did. But in any event, the fact that you could actually go to a cinema in the middle of a kind of, like Western Australian town somewhere and see something that's been beamed around the world, I think is magnificent. And I'm such a big supporter of NT Live doing that.
I guess finally, what do you hope the legacy of Inter Alia is?
Well, what's been really interesting is we've had lots of kind of men's groups, and also the Schools Consent Project, which we actually partnered with Prima Facie, that's gone out to, I think it's thousands and thousands and thousands of school children that have now, I think they've got 70,000 schools even.
70,000.
17,000. But they're actually now rolling it out in America after
Amazing.
Broadway as well. But now they're also on board for this one, so the conversation is also to talk to boys about some of those difficult issues around casual misogyny and the sort of boy gang and what have you. But also there's been some really interesting boys groups with like men that run like conversations with young men and boys, and that's been, and I did a round table at the Algonquin in New York, which was amazing, with a fellow who was with Eve Onsor, who's now known as V, but she wrote the Vagina Monologues, and she's very big on sexual assault kind of conversations and about what we can do to change things. And she partners with a man there who's just amazing at actually really getting into sort of boys' homes and having conversations to counteract so much that is actually happening online. Because there's so much more than we know. I mean, the research for this really shocked me. And I think,
how much did you do?
I had to do a lot. I interviewed 10 different female judges, like on sort of one-on-one interviews for sort of 2 hours each, where they told me all of them had a son, some of them had a daughter as well. And all of them said that they'd spent hours wondering about this dilemma themselves, because as their boys grew up and started dating or the online dating and what have you. And like it's something that was really quite a big concern of theirs. Like now that they've been in the court system, what would they do, sort of thing. And so that was really fascinating. But also they talked about some of the things that are threaded through the play, which is how hard it is to be a female judge, and how the whole system is set up for male judges and the respect that comes through. And in fact, in the program notes for Inter Alia that I wrote for the National, just that week before I wrote them, there was a case in America where the male litigant spoke to the female judge and just called her honey. And then apologised profusely and said, "Oh God, I'm shaken." She goes, "So am I." So it's just, that would never happen to a male judge. But also the little things like people chattering before they've left the courtroom and having to kind of use a voice that's sterner, or they just have to sort of definitely impress upon people that they're actually serious and to be taken seriously. And they talk about how difficult that is and how the further up the ranks you go, how hard it is. And what was interesting is that of all the courts, the Old Bailey actually has parity of gender, where they've gone out of their way to do it. It's the only court in the whole of Britain that has that level of women judges. But it's really had an effect. And one of those judges that changed the law was from the Old Bailey, as was the woman who actually has made it mandatory for all judges to watch Prima Facie. She was a woman from the Old Bailey. So there's no surprise for me that that's the case. That once they're there, they actually get to start those conversations. And I wanted Jessica to be one of those judges. She's now, Rosamund has now met all of those judges, and and has had quite a good community with them, So they have dinner, and she wants to do them proud, she says.
It's just incredible. Well, Suzie, thank you so much for getting straight off the plane.